Welcome to another virtual Live Talks Los Angeles event. We welcome Jon Meacham to our series and welcome back Frank Buckley, who's previously interviewed a host of guests, Lisa Napoli, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Chris Matthews, and Doris Kearns-Goodwin, among others. All of those videos are in our YouTube channel. Today they discuss Jon's book, His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. Meacham is a Pulitzer Prize winning biographer, contributing writer to the New York Times Book Review, and a contributing editor at Time magazine. The New York Times bestsellers include The Soul of America, The Battle of Our Better Angels, The Hope of Glory, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House, American Gospel, and Franklin and Winston. He holds the Rogers Chair in American Presidency at Vanderbilt University. Frank is the anchor of KTLA Morning News, and prior to that was at CNN, where he was a national correspondent. Frank also hosts the Frank Buckley Interviews podcast. Welcome again to both of you, and I'll let Frank take it from here.
Well, thank you, Ted. And Jon, welcome to Live Talks LA. And
can I just jump in? I'm no Kareem. I just want to say that. And the fact that you've interviewed Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, I'm in awe. So it's all downhill from here.
I thought you were going to stop the whole thing here, but I could see you're not Kareem, but you are of as great a stature in other arenas.
Exactly.
So we appreciate you being here, sir. Your book could not be more timely, given our attention right now to social justice issues and racial equality in 2020. And I also think that your reassuring voice through this book, as it came through in The Soul of America, that we can get through moments like this will inspire folks. So I'm looking forward to hearing that voice as we discuss His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope, a book I've truly enjoyed. I'd also like to ask you about your decision to appear at the Democratic National Convention. And if we have a couple of minutes at the end, I want to talk to you about the state of journalism today as the former editor of Newsweek and get your thoughts on that. But let's begin with your book and this incredible life of John Robert Lewis, the son of sharecroppers from Pike County, Alabama, who would go on to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda, an honor that's afforded to only the most prominent of Americans, becoming the first Black lawmaker to do so. He would be eulogized by presidents, eulogized by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, an institution he served for 30 years. Nancy Pelosi said of him that he was one of the greatest heroes of American history, the conscience of the Congress. And in your book, you say of John Lewis, quote, he was as important to the founding of a modern and multi-ethnic 20th and 21st century America as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Samuel Adams were to the creation of the Republic in the 18th century. You have written about our presidents and about our founding fathers. And I wonder, why did you make that connection to our founding fathers?
Because where the founders articulated an ideal, John Lewis insisted that we make the ideal real. He was about not simply words, but action. And in many ways, the country we live in can be traced to 1965, 64, 65. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Immigration and Nationality Act that shifted the demography of the country. That's the nation we're living in. And a very uncomfortable reality for folks who look like us is that until 1968, every presidential election in the United States took place under a form of apartheid because of the blocking of the right to vote, the disenfranchisement of Black Americans. So we're 20 minutes old at doing this, really. And we are doing it not least because John Lewis and Diane Nash and Bernard Lafayette and Julian Bond and Andrew Young and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks all insisted that our words had to comport with our actions. We had to make those things real. And John Lewis, at every point, was willing to die for that vision of America. And don't take my word for it. I mean, that is explicitly what they were doing. They were asking for the right to vote. They were asking to fully participate. They weren't seeking special treatment. They were seeking American treatment.
You tell your story through the book in a linear fashion. So I'd like to start that way as well, and ask you to take us all back to his childhood. He famously preached to the chickens at the house, and thought he would go in that direction. Was there anything in his childhood that signaled the greatness that was to come?
I think there was. I think it was his innate revulsion at the segregated order. Right? It was just apparent to him that this was wrong. The only white person he saw with any regularity growing up was the mailman. He didn't particularly like going into town because of the white only and colored only signs. When the Brown decision came down in May of '54, he was sitting on their dilapidated bus waiting for his white friends to show up, figuring that white kids were coming now because the Supreme Court had said it. That tributary of his innate revulsion intersected with his Christianity. And it was not a sectarian thing. He had no interest in Christian doctrine or fighting about ecclesiastical matters, but he heard the stories of the Bible. He absorbed the great narrative of exile and deliverance. And one of the things I found in doing this, which I intuitively knew but hadn't quite tracked out, was how biblical his life was. I ask him, one of the things I do as a biographer is I always ask a subject, what is your first memory and what do you dream about? And for John Lewis, his first memory was of his mother's garden. So it begins in a garden. I know another story that began in a garden. He went through, his name was changed when he went to college. He was Robert Lewis or Bob back in Troy, but he became John, like Abraham, like Elijah, like Peter. His name was changed as God intervened in his life. He had periods of exile where he had been defeated by Stokely Carmichael for the chairmanship of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he moves to New York and lives by himself in great anguish because he had been rejected, he had been scorned. And so again and again, this biblical drama is manifested in his life. And one of the things that I talked to him about for almost 30 years was his belief that if you and I did the right thing, if we actually got our hearts and minds in the right place, we could help bring about the beloved community, the kingdom of God on earth, that it could come into being right here. I don't believe that. I think we're a tragic, fallen, frail, and fallible world, that we can make it a little better, but we're never going to make it perfect. John Lewis disagreed. And unlike me, he was willing to die for his vision. And so it's this ambient, tangible hope that drove him.
We'll talk about his willingness to die when we get into the tactics that he learned of nonviolence a little bit later. But we left off at 54. In 55, Emmett Till was killed. What did that say to him, and how did that inform the rest of his life?
Yeah, Emmett Till was a teenager from Chicago. He was visiting relatives in Money, Mississippi in 1955. He was a year younger, I think, than John. He was lynched for making alleged sexual overtures to a white woman who later recanted and said that he had not. He ends up in the Tallahatchie River, beaten to death, tied to an engine fan. The pictures of that lynching were widely disseminated. His mother was quite brave, Till's mother, in allowing that to happen because she wanted the world to see what segregation could do. John saw those pictures. He read about the story. He knew that could have been him quite easily in segregated Alabama in the 1950s. The media mattered enormously to him. He read about the Brown decision. He read about Till. He heard about the bus boycott on the radio in Montgomery and heard Dr. King. And so what he saw, and fascinatingly, I think, is he saw a mirror in the larger world, a mirror and a means to channel what he was intuitively feeling about the world around him. And that dialectic helped propel him forward.
He wanted to go to one of the historically Black colleges. His family couldn't afford it. He decided to go to Nashville to enter the seminary and to fulfill that seemingly what we thought he would do, which was to become a pastor. What happens in Nashville?
Well, he arrives in the fall of 1957. It's a tiny school, still a tiny school, called in those days, American Baptist Theological Seminary. Bernard Lafayette is his roommate. James Bevel is there. C.T. Vivian is there. It's called the Holy Hill. It's right across the Cumberland River, not far from here. And he intersected with a remarkable set of aspiring preachers, and then ultimately with Kelly Miller Smith, who was the pastor of the largest Black church in town, and James Lawson. And James Lawson, who preached at the funeral at Ebenezer some weeks ago, Lawson was, in many ways, the instrument that gave the movement its form. He was the son of I think he's the most important American, by the way, and he lives in LA. Most important American that not enough people know.
I believe he's 91 years old now.
Yeah, and marvelous. And he was the son of a Methodist minister. He was a Methodist minister. He was a conscientious objector during the Korean War, was jailed for refusing to go to fight, got out of jail, went to India. He didn't know Gandhi, because Gandhi, I think, was dead by then, but he did know lieutenants. And he learned the tactics that Gandhi had done. And Howard Thurman, who was a great figure at Howard University and at Boston University, had gone early on. So there was this African-American encounter with the Indian independence movement that proved to be fascinating and important. So Lawson comes back, and he's at Oberlin, and he meets a young guy from Montgomery named Martin Luther King. And King realizes the experience that Lawson's had in India, understands that Lawson comes out of the tradition, the religious tradition, and says, "You're what we need in the South." Lawson ends up in Nashville, working for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a reform group founded by Norman Thomas and Jane Addams and others. And Lawson is recruiting. And Kelly Miller Smith, the pastor, knows young John Lewis because the kids, if you will, from the seminary went to that church. And Smith said, young John Lewis is ready. That experience of segregation in Troy was evident. Mm-hmm. And so they met every Tuesday evening at Clark Memorial United Methodist Church, a little red brick church not far from where I'm sitting. And Lawson taught them the means and methods and philosophy of nonviolence. And in that way, the Christian gospel and Gandhi came together to form this remarkable generation of activists.
And let's take this moment then to talk about some of those tactics, because I think all of us wonder, how could they subject themselves to this sort of, not just hatred, but the physical abuse without striking back. And you write about that. And you said that Lewis told you that Reverend Lawson taught them that, quote, you have to do more than just not hit back. You have to have no desire to hit back. You have to love that person who's hitting you. How did they take that into their souls? Because it's such an unnatural thing.
It's absolutely unnatural. It's the root of the religious traditions and the secular moral traditions of the world. And it's one of the reasons we're sitting here talking about it is so few people have done it. John Lewis was one. It was an example of a group of people taking the words that so many of us profess actually seriously. It was the Sermon on the Mount in action. And once the commitment was made, John never looked back. It doesn't seem to have been a great struggle to have done it. And I think that's because of that childhood experience you ask about. I think the evil of segregation, the fear of lynching, was so great that that generation had to make a decision. And Diane Nash told me this. She was part of those workshops. That nonviolence was a way of life, yes, but it was also practical because they couldn't take up arms because they would have been killed. And so if your mission in life is to create opportunity, to find justice, then you find the best means by which you can do it. And nonviolence became that means. It was not uncontroversial. You know, one of the things that fascinated me about the reaction to Congressman Lewis's death in July is there was almost no talk about the debates over nonviolence that unfolded in real time and certainly in retrospect within the movement. You know, again, John Lewis was out of fashion starting about 1966 because people, Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, and others, and this is all very complicated, but they were thinking this Sunday school piety, this taking the cigarette in your back, you know, letting people hit you. Why do that? Why? You know, we have to fight back. I am a man. John was devoted to that path.
Let's talk about his first act of, it wasn't really not a nonviolent protest in what would come later, but it was nonviolent reconnaissance at Harvey's department store in Nashville. And they were thinking that they would follow in the footsteps of those who had attempted to desegregate the lunch counter in Greensboro at Woolworth's there. And what could we do to support them? And so they go to Harvey's, and my sense is, in your writing about that moment, that this was his first thought of, I'm actually defying the norms. Is that how to describe it?
That's right. There's a marvelous documentary that Chet Huntley narrated called Sit-In. That's very modern, actually. It was made in 61 after the Nashville experience. And yes, the Nashville students had been preparing for this. They went downtown. The rule was you always bought something, you know, a notebook or something. So you were a paying customer. You wore a coat and tie. You said, yes, ma'am, and yes, sir. You gave the enemy nothing, right? You made them act out of hate. And you loved them, as you were saying, but you forced them to be in the wrong. And they were sent out. And then Greensboro, I think that was November, December of 60, and then, 59. And then the Greensboro sit-in, it was unplanned, happens in February, I think, of 60. And a minister called over, a minister named Douglas Campbell, called Jim Lawson and said, what can the students of Nashville do to support the students of Greensboro? And they were ready, and they went.
Yeah.
And it was the largest, those sit-ins in Nashville were the largest civil rights demonstrations of their kind. And they were incredibly successful. It was difficult, it was scary, but they were ready because they didn't just wake up one morning and say, we got to go fix this, right? They'd been preparing. And that was always a hallmark of Jon's view of reform and progress, is that you had to be disciplined. You had to follow the rules. You had to understand why the rules were there, what the philosophy was. And it changed the country.
He actually, as I understand it through your writing, this was the first time after days of that sit-in that he finally got to experience the pain, the physical pain. He almost seemed to be longing to experience.
Yes, and that's very saintly, right? It's very Christian in that sense. It was also his first arrest, and that was an extraordinary moment because his parents didn't want him getting arrested. Because guess what happens to Black men who get arrested? They don't always come back out. Yeah. But he talked about how when he went to jail that first time, how liberating it was. And I'm convinced, and he agreed with this often very privately, that biblical story was playing in his head. He knew he was one of the apostles. He knew this was a New Testament story. And Paul and Silas being imprisoned, and when Nebuchadnezzar locks up in the book of Daniel, locks them up, that was all quite real to them, and incredibly brave and noble. And one of the things on the saintliness point, I believe him to be a saint in the classical Christian sense of the term. And I spend a lot of time in the book making the point that saints are not supposed to frighten us off by the perfection of their example, right? They're not supposed to be in stained glass. They're not supposed to be on a pedestal. They're human, but they're just a little bit better than the rest of us. And the point of the notion of a saint is that if that sinner, if that human being can do that, then I can too. And in that sense, I don't see how he's not a canonical figure. And what's so amazing about him is he's a canonical figure who was in our midst.
Right. But let me ask you, because you also make the point that not everyone described him that way. You talk about Joseph Lowery, who became president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He said to you, "I've never heard anybody in the Black community say that."
Yeah, Lowery's fabulous. We just lost him too. He was the one who, the minister who gave that marvelous benediction at Obama's inaugural, where he broke in to lift every voice and sing. True enough, but Jim Lawson agrees with me, and I'll take that. The danger in this for me, the potential trouble in this for me, and I worried about this throughout, and I'm still a little bit, but not as much, is I don't want to give the impression that as a white guy, I just found the one Black guy of whom we can approve, right? And because Jon's message is in fact the most radical of messages. It's only, not just because of the you said unnatural, which I think is exactly right. To embody the Sermon on the Mount is to counter-program our fallen nature in a profound way.
Right.
That is itself radical. If you are devoted to trying to bring about that beloved community, you are devoted to a project that will bring down the principalities and powers of the world, and justice will come down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. But that's not the same as a land of milk and honey, right? That's a reversal of the existing order of things. So both both in religious terms, which are less well appreciated, and in secular terms, John Lewis's message is the most radical of messages within an American context. He did believe in the Constitution. He did believe in the capacity to amend it and adjust it. Mm-hmm. But he was a revolutionary. And I think to try to domesticate him does a disservice to his memory and actually caricatures what he really stood for.
Now, when you say that domesticate, what do you mean by that? Because people will say, well, what does that mean, to domesticate him?
To make his message safe and unthreatening, right? To somehow take a radical and revolutionary message and say, well, we're done with that.
I see.
Because the Jim Crow signs are gone. That's a huge mistake, because the radical nature of his message is that we must seek justice again and again and again.
Yeah. He meets Reverend King, Martin Luther King Jr., and Ralph Abernathy. What were the circumstances? I know he wrote a letter. Was it, and how did he receive that when he was summoned to meet them?
Yeah, he wanted to be Autherine Lucy. Autherine Lucy had been a young woman who attempted to desegregate the University of Alabama in '56. She had been chased off campus. He was in Nashville and wanted to try to desegregate Troy State University, which was the state college nearest Pike County where he grew up. He wrote Dr. King a letter. King replied, invited him to come to Montgomery. He met with a lawyer, Fred Gray, and Ralph Abernathy, and met Dr. King. This is the Christmas of 57, 58. And was flabbergasted and inspired. King was his hero. They talked to him. They reminded him of how difficult this could be on the family, and how difficult it could be in terms of retribution. He had a lot of brothers and sisters. His father drove a school bus. His mother had a lot of different jobs in addition to the farming. So this could not go well. He was willing to try it. He asked his parents, because he wasn't yet 18, he wouldn't be 18 until February. He asked his parents to sign the lawsuit, and they thought about it, but decided they couldn't do it. And so he went back to Nashville, which was in itself providential, because then the sit-in drama happened that we talked about.
I want to eventually get to Selma, Alabama, March 7th, 1965, and quickly get through a couple of major events and or movements. The Freedom Rides.
Yep.
I think a lot of people, my sons who are 23 and 19, if I said to them, do you know about the Freedom Rides? I don't know that they would know what that is. And can you tell us what it is, and then give us the context and what Congressman Lewis did?
Sure. There was remember, if you were a Black person, particularly in the South, but really around the country, buses were really important. It was how you got around. And the Supreme Court, there were segregated sections of the bus, there were segregated facilities when you stopped, restaurants, bathrooms, everything. And there had been a Supreme Court decision that had ordered the integration of those facilities, but no one had done it in my native region. And so in 1961, it was organized that there would be freedom rides, leaving from Washington, going through the South, and ending up in Jackson, Mississippi, in an attempt to desegregate those facilities. There were 15 or 16. It was an integrated group. And John first trip to Washington was to get up there and then ride the bus back. He was beaten in Rock Hill, South Carolina, by a Klansman who, parenthetically, 40 years later, almost 50 years later, when Obama was elected president, that Klansman who had beaten John, a man named Elwyn Wilson, repented and reached out to Lewis and asked for his forgiveness, and they did events together because John granted it. They get to Alabama. It's incredible violence. The Freedom Riders end up locked in bus stations overnight. They end up in churches trying to stay away from mobs. Lewis is driven by Bull Connor himself.
Yeah.
If you made this up, they bounce the script, right? Drives them to the state line between Alabama and Tennessee. And then Lewis and his colleagues find a place to spend the night. A brave Black family took them in. And then John called Nashville to Diane Nash and said, "What do you want us to do?" And the Attorney General of the United States had asked them to stop. Diane Nash and John Lewis and others decide that this is the inflection point. This is the moment where if the freedom rides were to stop, if the nonviolent protests were to stop in the face of violence, that would set back whatever work they had done. And remember, the bus was bombed, the famous picture of the bus being bombed. I mean, people could die.
Yeah.
But they get back, they go back south, they go back to Montgomery and Birmingham, and they press on to Jackson. And when he gets off the bus in Jackson, Mississippi, he's arrested and sent to Parchman Penitentiary, which William Faulkner described as destination doom. And it was in his memory, the decision led by Diane Nash to keep going was a critical moment.
And since you mentioned Bull Connor, Birmingham, 1963, Bull Connor's reaction to what's happening in his city. Who was Bull Connor and what did he do and how did that move the Kennedy administration?
Yeah, he was the public safety, Eugene Theophilus, how do you say that? Eugene T. O'Connor, how's that? He was known as Bull because he had done play-by-play announcing for the local Birmingham minor league team. And he was so good at bulling his way through conversations. He had served in the State House, I believe. He had been part of the 1948 delegation at the Democratic National Convention that walked out with Strom Thurmond and created the Dixiecrats when President Truman and Mayor Humphrey then of Minneapolis had pushed for civil rights. He'd become the public safety commissioner, which was functionally the police chief of Birmingham. And as somebody said in a piece published at the time, Bull is the law in Birmingham. And he was just an unrepentant segregationist. And at every point managed to do the wrong thing. And in 1963, when Dr. King and others hit upon the strategy, and it was a strategy, to have the children of Birmingham walk in the streets, and Connor responded with fire hoses and police dogs. And those images flashed around the world. And that's why on June 11th, 1963, John Kennedy proposed a Civil Rights Act. Kennedy joked in a meeting, I tell this story in the book, in a meeting with civil rights leaders, he said, "You all should be thanking Bull Connor." And there was sort of this gasp. And he said, "He's done more for civil rights than anybody else."
Let's go to August 28th, 1963, the March on Washington, that everyone, we associated as the "I Have a Dream" speech from Martin Luther King Jr. We forget that John Lewis spoke for 7.5 minutes that day as well. Yeah. What did he say on the 28th? And take us behind the scenes of how that day came to be.
Yeah, he was chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was in that capacity that he was on the program. He had written a speech with help that was pretty harsh on the Kennedy administration, on the bill. And remember the context here. The Kennedy administration urged the organizers of the March on Washington to turn it around, basically. So instead of marching to the Capitol, which is what the original plan was, they marched, so to speak, to the Lincoln Memorial. The fear was that Congress would react badly if they felt they were being pressured. Two Kennedy officials were stationed inside the Lincoln Memorial on that day. It was a Wednesday, ready to cut the microphone and play Mahalia Jackson's "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands" over the loudspeakers if the speeches got too radical. The initial draft of John's speech was a bit tougher than the final one. I'm of the opinion that if we didn't have the first draft, we wouldn't think the second one was very soft. He took out an allusion to marching through the South like Sherman. So there were a few edits. Those of us who do things have been edited like that a lot through the years. What he was really saying, and it really was, again, a radical speech, a revolutionary speech, I should say. Radical has a different connotation now. He said, we don't want to be patient. We want our freedom now. We don't want to be beaten by policemen. We don't want to go to jail anymore. We want our freedom. We want our share of the American promise. Again, it wasn't asking for special treatment. It was just asking for what we said was going to be universal. And I asked Harry Belafonte, who is the coolest man on the planet, by the way. He's 108, and he's so much cooler than, I won't say cooler than you, but way cooler than me. I will say it, he's cooler than you. But I interviewed him about this, and he said, he was very close to Dr. King, and King would stay with him in New York. And he said, I know Martin did so well that day, but the truly great speech that day was John Lewis's. And part of the power of it is that Dr. King spoke from the mountaintop. Lewis was in the valley with the people. And it's very specific. It actually it's a little trickier to write about because you have to explain what Danville, Virginia was, and what Cambridge, Maryland, what he was, Eastland, Thurman, and Stennis, these Southern segregationist senators. You have to explain. But what makes it a little tricky to talk about historically is what made it so powerful in the moment. Because remember, speeches, there's a reason they're speeches, right? It's for that commerce of the moment. The other fun, tiny thing, if anybody ever YouTubes it, is he's going along in the speech and very confident. It's delivered beautifully. But at one point, Bayard Rustin, who was the organizer and smoking a cigarette, he leans in and says something. And so after I watched that, I called Congressman Lewis. I said, what did Bayard say to you? He said, hurry it up, John, hurry it up. All world is all about hitting your time marks.
Well, to that point, let's get to the Edmond Pettis Bridge.
Yeah.
March 7th, 1965. I want to know, did Congressman Lewis think did he have any thought at all that they would let him pass?
I don't think yes, I think so. The police, Governor Wallace, they were kind of making it up as they went along too. I don't think he was expecting, let me put it this way. He was expecting to be arrested. So when you say pass, I was thinking about the beatings only. He had packed his backpack with a couple of books and fruit and a toothbrush because he thought he was going to go over the bridge and they would arrest him again.
Yeah.
I don't think he foresaw the violence of that day.
He didn't.
No, they were always ready for it, but there was a genuine surprise when they saw the number of troops when they came over. Have you ever been on the bridge?
I have not.
It's worth doing because it's not small, right? I mean, it's way up there. The Alabama River is a big thing. This was very dramatic. Sometimes these bridges are little. Mm-hmm. This was, over there. And they get to the top and they look down. And as John said, it was a blue wave. It was a blue wall. Mm. And so I think he expected to be in jail. I don't think he expected to be in the hospital.
Hmm. And some have suggested that bridge be renamed. Did you ever talk to him about that?
I didn't. I wish I had now. I don't know where he'd land on that. I think there's something about, as you know, Edmond Pettis was a Confederate officer and the Grand Dragon of the KKK. There's something about that is already, because of what it is, it already honors those folks. And John would be the first to say, not just him. I leave that to the state of Alabama and all that. But one of the reasons I wrote this is I was with him on that last trip in March. And Jim Lawson was there, and he gave this amazing talk. And it was clear that Time's winged chariot was catching up with him. The pancreatic cancer was catching up with him. But as he put it, some of us shed a little blood on this bridge to try to help redeem the soul of America. And I would love to walk across a John Lewis Bridge, but whatever it's called, what happened there is what matters most.
I wonder if you'd ever have a chance to ask him about the generations that have followed him.
Yeah.
And I count my sons among them, again, 19 and 23, who take it for granted that they and their friends can vote, as we all do, who they may not know all of the struggles and the physical pain that people like John Lewis experienced. Did it bother him at all that younger people, while many continued to think of him and remember him, that some people might not know him or might not know the struggles that went into making some of the things that we take for granted today?
Yeah.
They don't remember it or know about it.
That's a great question. He very much believed, partly because of what we talked about Emmett Till and the bus boycott and the role of the media, the role of narrative. He understood the importance of telling the story. And he never tired of it, not because it made him into a hero, but because he knew that there's something in the human brain and heart that makes us respond to story. And so it's one of the reasons I think he was so generous with me about this. He did endless commemorations and anniversaries of these events. Again, not to aggrandize himself, but to stand where America had made a critical turn. And if we did it once and we could all be standing there, then why can't we do it again? And that would be his lesson. I mean, I was there with I think I have one about your age. I have an 18-year-old, 18, 16, and 12. And I was so proud of them in a way. They were just kind of thunderstruck and they knew all these folks, right? They knew Ruby Bridges. They knew who Jim Lawson was. And I was just happy that they knew the people who had risked everything for freedom. And so not just presidents, not just senators, but the people who did it. And I think that would be his message. It was certainly his message about Black Lives Matter. Look, John Lewis understood imagery, right? And he knew that probably the last photograph ever taken of him was going to be at Black Lives Matter Plaza in the wake of the Floyd death. That was not happenstance.
Did it bother him that here we are in 2020, the streets filled with people once again protesting violence against Black people? That, yes, we have moved so far, but we are in some ways in the same place. Did it bother him, or did it make him happy that we were in the streets again?
I don't think it's happy. I think that he was unsurprised, if that makes sense. I think he he would want people in the streets nonviolently bearing witness in the way that he and his generation bore witness. And when asked, as I asked him to the very end, middle of June, last time we talked, he died the middle of July. He said, you can't give up hope. And if anyone thinks that progress and change in America aren't possible, come walk in my shoes. Right? You opened quite eloquently talking about, here's this sharecropper son whose great-grandfather was born in slavery, who was eulogized by presidents and mourned by millions. The power of that story is not how singular he is, but how wide that path can be for all of us. Mm. And I know that's what he believed. Mm.
This brings us to where we are today. And many of us were surprised to look up on the TV screen at the Democratic National Convention and see your face. To see you speak.
Startling.
Well, I don't know if it was startling, but it was a surprise for me because I always see you as a nonpartisan, as a historian who gives us perspective and context for the events of the day.
Yeah.
But by speaking at this convention, you entered the arena and took a side. Why?
Yep. Because I believe this is an existential election. I am not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I have voted for both parties. We don't register by party in Tennessee, and I've voted in both primaries through the years. But I believe, and I saw it as a kind of, I don't mean to sound grandiose, but I saw it as kind of a patriotic duty, a kind of an act of good citizenship to give when asked, to give my opinion. And my opinion is that whatever his imperfections, Joe Biden will be a better president for the durability of the American experiment and the promulgation of the kinds of justice we've been talking about than electing the incumbent to another term. And I don't think it's a close call. This isn't Obama-Romney, right? This is a stark choice. And Vice President Biden asked me to do it. I thought about it and realized that, I don't mean to get overly personal, but you asked. I was born in 1969 in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And so I wasn't around for all the issues the events we've been talking about, right? I like to think that if I'd been born in 1939 and had been in my early 20s, teens, from Brown through Selma, that I would have been on the right side of that. But I don't know. And a lot of folks who looked like me, who came from the part of the world I came from, weren't. So I don't know what I would have done in that crisis. But here we are in another crisis about the nature of the country. And at least I know that I did the right thing this time.
When you take a position today on anything, the reaction can be hateful. It can be, others will embrace you. And I just wonder, for someone who has been able to thread the needle, as it were, as someone who could take the middle road and say, here's the perspective, here's what's going on. Now you took a position. What has the reaction been? And has it surprised you?
It's an unfolding reaction. It's a great question. I am fully prepared for if there are repercussions. I can't imagine what they are. But I guess my point about this is what I did was not a profile in courage, right? The kid who stutters, who talked about it, that's a profile in courage, right? Julia Jackson, the mother of Jacob Blake, who just spoke out in Kenosha, that's courage. Gianna Floyd, the daughter of George Floyd, who told Joe Biden, my daddy changed the world, that's courage. I've spent my life thinking and viewing the world historically and theologically. I've been lucky enough to be able to make a living by telling these stories. Joe Biden asked me to define the soul of America at his convention. He did not ask me to endorse him. I was not told to say anything. It was my time. That was the terms on which I accepted, because I wouldn't have taken. I'm not a propagandist, right? I spoke as a historian and a citizen, and I'm not a reporter. I'm not a journalist. I was a journalist for a long time, but I haven't been for about 10 years. I just think that every once in a while you just do what you think is right, and come what may. Yeah. Come what may. I don't pay a lot of attention to the online jabbering. Again, I don't think. I think that if people don't speak up, this goes back to John, right? If you see something unjust, if you see something unfair, say something, do something. I said something, and I don't think it changes a single vote, but if it changes one, onward.
You said, as you noted, you were a journalist for the earlier part of your life, and you were the managing editor and the editor of Newsweek. And journalism has changed so much, and writing about this administration in particular as a journalist it's what I do every day. Yeah. It's a challenge, because we've never had to point out mistruths, lies in the way that we have now. And to do that makes you appear as a partisan when in fact you're not.
That connects, but that connects to what you just asked me about, right? I mean, to say that Donald Trump is more interested in himself than the nation he leads does not strike me as a real partisan reach, right? In fact, his supporters like that about him to some extent. So, we went through this during McCarthy. Joe McCarthy would make outlandish charges. Folks in our business would repeat them. And on the grounds that a United States senator said this, so it's news. There was a fellow out in Denver named Palmer Hoyt, who ran the paper out there, who actually pushed back and said, if it's not true, we're not going to print it. And I think we've been watching that debate unfold. You certainly have, in real time. Mm-hmm. And you have to decide, at what point is neutrality a virtue, and at what point is it a shield? And again, I think it would be different. You've clearly touched a nerve here. I think it would be different if and what I said about the country or reporters as they check the facts, if in speaking to these issues, we therefore pivoted to, and if you elect a Democrat or if you support this bill, therefore you will be right. So, Mr. President, you're wrong about these facts, and what we have to do is this. I think there's a legitimate journalistic function of reason to say, no, that's just not true, and let the country figure out what else they want to do. Yeah. I think those are two different things. And
so if you were me, John, as I
would try to book Kareem again. That's what I would do. But go ahead.
Well, after you did that, and you were in the position of reporting on the news of the day, and you wanted to be down the middle, as it were, someone who wasn't taking a side, who was, because Donald Trump has 42% of the nation who are in his corner and who believe, as you say, whatever he says, they're with him. And without validating that a point of view, how do you cover, again, you're me, how are you going to cover this president?
I think the test you have to make I'm guessing, are you reporting something true, or are you reporting something manufactured? And to report something that's manufactured or made up simply because it was said by a person of power doesn't seem to me to add to the sum of human knowledge. And it's a sign of the times that what I just said might even seem partisan, right? Because if we don't do this, I mean, imagine there are people who would be alive today if in 1964, 65, 66, 67, if journalists in Vietnam had spent more time reporting what they saw instead of what was said, right? So let's take it out of Trump. Let's go back. You know, the 5 o'clock follies, that was the old joke about the briefings, and the government would just sit there and lie. Well, that's kind of a cute phrase, but you know, my father fought in Vietnam and it wasn't that cute because they were fighting. So I think journalists, as well as politicians, as well as citizens, can do what I think of as the history test, which is think about what we honor and commemorate. Try to figure out what those lessons are and then apply them so that we're doing something that will be honored and commemorated. Right? So do you want to be Bull Connor or do you want to be John Lewis? It's a pretty easy call, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to be Edward R. Murrow, who turned on McCarthy? Or do you want to be the wire service guy who was just making the deadline and repeating false charges? I'd rather be Edward R. Murrow.
Yeah.
Now, this is easy for someone like me to say because I'm not in the arena in the way you are. But I think that's worth thinking about.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, John, and there are more questions from some of our audience members. So I'm going to step aside now. Thank you for the wonderful conversation and throw it over to Ted.
Thank you, Frank. We have time for just a few questions. John, the first question is about the craft of biography. This lady is curious to know, at what point did this book come to be? How much time did you spend with John Lewis? And how did he come to write the afterword? That seemed a little different for a biography. And do you consider this a biography?
I don't really. I think it's a profile. It's a book about John's life in the movement, his growing up, his life in the movement, and the religious understanding he brought to it. My colleague David Greenberg at Rutgers is doing a full biography. He's at work on it, and I think that'll be fabulous. And that helps answer the question that several of the questions. I first met him 28 years ago. I was lucky enough to be with him off and on through those decades. Always kept my notes. Always wanted to write about him someday, but honestly, I thought I had another 10 years or so because before the cancer diagnosis. And when the diagnosis happened, I realized that if I wanted to ask him any of these questions that Frank was asking me about, I needed to do it. And so as I said, we were at Selma in Birmingham and Montgomery with him in March. I called him up a couple of days later. I said, I'd like to do this because as I was standing there on the bridge that Sunday morning, not long ago, I realized that this is the antidote. Right? The spirit and substance of the movement is our best hope for moving out of this particular period of American gloom. And so I wanted to tell the story. This is my opinion. I believe every word in it. It doesn't cover his congressional career because I'm not that interested in his congressional career. I'm interested in how a 16, 17, 18-year-old great-grandson of a slave turned the most materially powerful nation in the world upside down for the better. The afterword I asked him to do because to some extent I wanted in his voice to answer some of the questions Frank was asking. What does he think? Is he hopeful? And I thought, because of the nature of the project, which was, this is what I think about his religious views, this is what I think about, it seemed to me to be a straightforward way to answer those questions, because don't all of us, it's behind the question from the person, all of us sometimes want to ask the subject of a biography what they think. And this was a chance to just take care of that.
Thanks, John. While John Lewis advocated for the idea of good trouble, how can this be done in the current cancel culture environment where people can be hostile to differing opinions?
Well, people were, Bull Connor was pretty hostile to different opinions. I think you just gotta work for and act within a world where reason has a chance against passion. I don't mean to be dismissive. I mean, any number of, this can happen to anyone. But one of the points of the experiment in liberalism and in reason was that there would be a free marketplace of ideas. And has the marketplace of ideas been part of a structure of white supremacy and patriarchy and domination? Yes. But does that mean, therefore, you close it down, or do you reform it and include more voices? And I think hopefully that's where that conversation is going.
A couple more questions. John, this gentleman says, I had the pleasure of doing business with your father, who could do a remarkable job to bring heated labor disputes to resolution. At a time of such division in our society, what lessons can we learn from John Lewis on how to listen to each other and work together towards common goals?
Marvelous question, and thank you for it was dangerous to be my father's son because he was a good negotiator, and therefore I never got what I wanted. So I'm glad somebody benefited from this. Lewis was about listening, and as we were talking about, he was about loving your enemy and picturing the hater as a child, right? So it was this radical revision of reality in real time. But he talked about it toward the end. Why is it that this country that professes these religious beliefs can be so unforgiving? And so one of the reasons I wanted to write this was that I think religious folks, if we, broadly put, were to get our profession of faith and our practice of it in somewhat closer harmony, we'd be better off.
And our final question, John, did he ever share with you any regrets he may have had?
He did regret the ferocity of his campaign against Julian Bond. In 1986, they were old friends and colleagues. They both ran for the same congressional seat in Atlanta. It was an ugly campaign. Both of them sort of got their competitive juices up, and he regretted that. But remarkably at peace by and large. And he was different from us, but there was enough similar that I think he's not necessarily a figure for reverence, but instead a figure for inspiration and illumination.
Thank you very much, John. It's great to have you at Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks, Frank, for returning to our stage and engaging with John.
Well,
thanks
now
again.
People will say to me, you're so cool because you've talked to Jon Meacham.
I have a feeling Kareem will not say that, but if he does, text me. Thank you all so much.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. The book, again, is His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope, and it is available wherever books are sold. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.